Okay. Shalom Aleichem. Thank you for joining. Tonight we're going to learn the halachas of harvesting. We spoke a little bit about harvesting last week, and now we're going to go into some of the rabbinical decrees that were made because of the prohibition of harvesting on Shabbos. One of the reasons why the rabbis, tzaddikim, made so many prohibitions about this particular prohibition is because it's so easy just to take an apple and pull it off the tree, and therefore they made, as we discussed last time, various prohibitions to prevent us from coming to take an apple off the tree. We learned last week how you're not allowed to smell an apple while it's attached to a tree, lest you forget and take the apple off the tree while you're smelling it, because you might want to eat the apple. We learned that if an apple falls off a tree on Shabbos, you're not allowed to pick the apple up from the floor and eat the apple. And we also learned that there are two other decrees that our sages have made because of harvesting. And that is, number one, you're not allowed to use an animal at all on Shabbos. And number two, you're not allowed to, the reason why you're not allowed to ride in an animal is because the sages made a decree, because if you ride an animal, you might end up taking a branch off a tree to guide the animal. And similarly, you're not allowed to use something which is attached to the ground at all. So those are the four general decrees that our sages have made. Tonight we're going to focus on the law of riding on an animal and see very practical applications, as that's our focus, to figure out halacha l'maisa, practical applications in halacha in our lives. So we're going to go through this from the Talmud to day-to-day life today. Let's begin with learning the Gemara. It says in the Gemara on Shabbos on page Kuf Nun Dalam and Beis, Abaya ashkechei leila rab lekomshash leila brei agav dachamr. Abaya found Rabbah playing with his son, and the way he was playing with his son, he was putting his son on a donkey, and he was putting his son on the donkey, on the side of the donkey, to just to play with him. So Amalei Abaya told his teacher Rabbah, "How can you do this? You're using an animal on Shabbos. You're using it for a game, but you're not allowed to use an animal at all on Shabbos." So Rabbah responded, "I'm only using the side of the animal." When our sages said you're not allowed to ride on an animal, they meant you can't ride on an animal. Riding on the animal, on top of the animal itself, but the side of the animal is not forbidden. They only made this decree, you can't ride on the animal lest you take a branch to help guide the animal. But if you're just going on the side of the animal, there is no prohibition. That's what Rabbah said. However, the Gemara goes on to discuss this at length and bring various opinions, and the conclusion of the Gemara is stadin asur, tzidei stadin mutter. The side of the animal is prohibited. The side of the side, which we'll see what that means in a moment, the side of the side is permissible. What does that mean? The side of the side. There's a similar expression regarding the laws of using a tree. It says about a tree, you're not allowed to use the side of a tree, but the side of a tree you're allowed to. What does that mean? So regarding a tree, it's very simple. Let's say you have a hammock. You want to attach your hammock to a tree to lie on the hammock on Shabbos. So halacha is that you're not allowed to not only climb a tree on Shabbos, but you're not allowed to even use a hammock which is attached to the tree. It's called sidei. It's considered to be like the side of the tree. It's considered to be secondary to the tree. But if you had, let's say, a basket, the basket was attached to a hook that was driven into the tree, so then it will be okay for you to put something inside that basket. you wouldn't be allowed to put the basket on that hook, because then you'll be using something that's attached to the tree. But the basket itself is called a secondary of secondary, or vice, or whatever you want to use the expression in English. It's not considered the tree. It's not considered secondary to the tree. It's a third step removed from the tree. And so then therefore you're allowed to use the basket and put something in the basket, take something out of the basket, which is attached to a hook, which is driven into the tree. You could also, similarly, similarly, you're allowed to take a ladder and put a ladder against the tree, and then the ladder itself is considered the side of the tree, and therefore the ladder would be forbidden. But if there would be a hook that the ladder was leaning against, so then you'll be allowed to, if a hook was driven into the tree and there's a ladder leaning against that hook, so then it will be permissible for you to climb on that ladder on Shabbos. So let's transfer this halacha now to the laws of an animal. The Alter Rebbe says in Siman Shin Hey, Korin Shabehema Siman Shin Hey Sif Chav Gimel. If there is a wagon, a animal is leading this wagon inside an area where you're allowed to carry on Shabbos. Even though there's a non-Jew who is guiding the animal, and therefore there's no reason to worry about a Jew taking a branch and trying to hit the animal to guide the animal, because he's not even sitting on the animal. But nevertheless, Alter Rebbe says not only are you not allowed to lead the wagon, you're not allowed to even sit on the wagon itself. Why not? Because the whole entire wagon is considered to be the side of the animal. Although the wagon isn't directly attached to the animal, out of the wagon comes these two pieces of iron. The iron is attached to some piece of leather, which is attached to the animal. But the Alter Rebbe says we consider the entire wagon to be one entity with the leather, and therefore you're sitting on the wagon is considered to be sitting on the side of the animal. However, if there will be a ladder, let's say, that's perched on the wagon, then the Alter Rebbe said that's okay. That's considered the side of the animal, and therefore that will be permissible. There is in the Rebbe's library one sefer of the Alter Rebbe that belonged to the Alter Rebbe, and the Alter Rebbe wrote various notes on this sefer, or more accurately, there's one note of the Alter Rebbe that the Alter Rebbe makes a comment on the sefer of the Maharik. The Maharik quotes from Sefer HaTruma, and Sefer HaTruma says that if a non-Jew is leading the animal, a Jew is allowed to sit on the wagon. The whole point of the decree is that a Jew may take a branch to guide the animal. If a non-Jew is anyways, he is leading the animal, he's leading the wagon, he is sitting in the front and he's leading the wagon, there's no reason to prohibit it. So the Sefer HaTruma is quoted by the Maharik, and the Maharik says that it will be permissible for you to sit in the wagon in the case of a non-Jew leading the wagon. But the Alter Rebbe comments on this and says, Ze'enoi. Ze'enoi is halachic terminology for this is incorrect. It's a very strong expression. Usually the expressions are tzarachion, we need to look at this more carefully, but the Alter Rebbe in his personal volume of the Maharik, which is the only book we have from the Alter Rebbe, any book that the Alter Rebbe wrote his own notes on, and they only have one note, and this is the note. There are other notes, but more about like sources, but this is the Alter Rebbe brings a actual comment on this book, and he says this is incorrect because the Maharik is quoting the Sefer HaTruma. The Sefer HaTruma does seem to be saying what the Maharik is saying. However, the Sefer HaTruma has two parts. He has his table of contents, and he has the actual halachas. And although in the halachas itself, it seems like what the Maharik says is correct, but if you look in the table of contents, you can see clearly that he says that although a non-Jew is leading the wagon, a Jew is forbidden to sit on the wagon because it's called tzidei habehema, the side of an animal. Again, the only thing you're allowed to do is to perhaps lean on the side of the wagon, which is called the side of the wagon, or to have a ladder, which is leaning against the wagon. But for a Jew to sit on the wagon would be prohibited. The wording of the Alter Rebbe is Ze'einai. This is incorrect. If you look and see money at Truma V'chinas Sparsh Mordechai and Ramah, that's what the Mordechai and Ramah both agree, that it's forbidden for a Jew to sit on a wagon, although a non-Jew is leading it. And this is a general theme in halacha, that when our sages made a decree, they made the decree in all instances, even though the reason may not seem to apply in this particular instance, because the Jew is not anyways going to take a branch and lead and hit the horse, because he's not leading the wagon anyways. But our sages made a decree to cover all scenarios. There is an unusual measure of prohibitions and decrees that our sages made about using an animal. Not only are you not allowed to lean against the animal, our sages said further that in Siman Shin Hey Sif Chav Gimel, it says, you're not allowed to lean against it. You're not allowed to use an animal at all. But then he adds something. He says that even if you're trying to put a leash on the animal, you have to be very careful when you put the leash on the animal not to lean against the animal. Siman Shin Hey Sivdal Mutal Tatla After Arrest Little Al Behema Kitzah, but you're allowed to put on the muzzle on the animal. It's used for the animal. It's not considered muktzah. Be careful though. The Alter Rebbe says, don't lean against the animal while you put it on. But he says there's one thing you're not allowed to put on the animal. You can't put the saddle on the animal. Why not? Because it's impossible to put a saddle on the animal without leaning against it. So not only are you not allowed to use an animal, but you're not allowed to even do something which is connected to the animal. You can't put the saddle on the animal, because if you put the saddle on, you're inevitably going to lean against the animal. It says, for example, also that if an animal arrives in your home carrying a burden on Erev Shabbos, and there's you want to remove the burden from the animal, so there's, let's say, two bags that are tied to each other on the back of the animal. The Alter says you're allowed to remove them, but you have to be careful. Don't lean against the animal, and not even put a saddle on, because it's inevitably going to lean against the animal. So we see how much the weight the Chachamim put on this decree of using an animal, to the extent you're not allowed to even do something which will cause you to lean against the animal. Usually for muktzah, the laws of muktzah don't prohibit us to lean against muktzah. Something which is muktzah, you're allowed to lean against it, you're just not allowed to move it. Here is unique. The Chacham, for example, a rock. You're allowed to sit on top of a rock on Shabbos, although a rock is muktzah. But the reason you're allowed to sit on it, because you're not moving the rock. But here, our sages said that you're not only not allowed to move the animal, you're also not allowed to put the saddle on the animal. The question is like this: how come there's a difference between the laws of using the side of the animal, leaning against an animal, which the Chacham said is forbidden because you might end up taking a branch and guiding the animal? How come the Chacham weren't as careful regarding leaning against a tree? Let's say you want to tie your shoes and you're walking on Shabbos, you want to lean against a tree on Shabbos, you're allowed to do that. So the Alter Rebbe says, although he says that you're not allowed to use a side of a tree, only the side of a side, but he writes in Siman Shin Lamed Vav, Sif Chaf Aleph, you're allowed to lean against a healthy tree. Meaning, if the tree is not going to move, it's a healthy tree, you're allowed to lean against that tree. If it's a weaker tree, you're not allowed to. Why? Because you are causing the tree to move. You're using a tree. You can't lean against the tree. How come we are more lenient regarding a tree, and we say that if the tree is a healthy tree, you could lean against the tree, but by an animal, we say that you cannot lean against the animal? Now, you might want to say that the difference is that the tree, the animal isn't going to move, but it's not really true. If you try to put a muzzle on an animal, you're going to move the animal. And it's not because of movement. The truth is, by an animal, there are leniencies that the sages gave for an animal, far more than by a tree. For example, usually things which are muktzah. An animal is considered muktzah on Shabbos. Anything which has no usage on Shabbos is considered muktzah. If it's not a vessel, it's not a food, it says in Siman Shinches, kol davar she'ein teres kli alav, anything which has no status of a vessel, there's no usage on Shabbos. It's not food for a person, or food for an animal. For example, animals, he says they are not considered a keli, not considered a utensil. You're not allowed to move them on Shabbos. And he says, not only not allowed to move them, a regular animal, I feel people think if an animal belongs to you, so then it has different status. But the Alter Rebbe doesn't seem to subscribe to that opinion. The Alter Rebbe writes in Siman Sif Ein Ches and Siman Shin Ches, let's say you have a bird. You use this bird to entertain your child. Your child needs to, his child is crying. You want your child to calm down. So you have a bird in the house. You give the child a bird in order to calm down. So the Alter Rebbe says you're not allowed to move the bird on Shabbos. The bird is considered muktzah. It's forbidden to move the bird on Shabbos. But there are different leniencies regarding an animal. If you tell the animal, hey, I'll have food for you outside, why don't you come with me? The animal won't exactly know what you're talking about. So because it's Tzar Ba'alei Chayim, you want to feed the animal, so you are allowed to slap the back of the animal, push the animal along, so it will go to eat the food. As it says in Shimon Shin Ches Ayin Tes, called you're allowed to push them along in a private domain. You're allowed to hold its neck and help it move it along so that for the sake of the animal, the animal needs to eat, you're allowed to push the animal along. So the sages were lenient for the animal for the sake of the animal. But we don't find that the leniency that we find by trees, by animals. By trees, we say that for your own, not for the animal's sake. For your sake, you want to lean against the animal because you want to play with your child. We found before that Abaye met Rabbah, and Rabbah had put the baby on the side of the animal, and Abaye said it's wrong. Not that that's how the halacha is. But by a tree, we say that it's okay. You're allowed to lean against the tree. Why is that? Why are we more strict by an animal than we are by a tree? So you might think the difference between them is that just halacha has a different source for the laws of an animal, laws of a tree, and therefore we are more strict by the laws of a animal. But the truth is that it's the opposite. The distinction that the Alter Rebbe makes between a healthy tree and a healthy and a weak tree that gets moved, that when you lean against it, it moves along, it gets pushed. This distinction actually comes to the Gemara Yerushalmi. Gemara Yerushalmi brings two opinions in two different brises. One brisa says you're allowed to lean against a tree. One brisa says you can't. Lean against an animal. And one brisa says you're not allowed to lean against an animal. And then Chisda explains it depends what kind of animal. If it's a strong animal, it won't get moved by you. So then you're allowed to lean against the animal. If it's not a strong animal, it's a bird or whatever, it's going to get moved. You lean against it, then you cannot lean against it. So the whole source of this distinction we're making between healthy and non-healthy, or strong or not, or weak, actually comes from the laws of animals. And yet we say that regarding a tree, only regarding a tree, not regarding an animal. The Alter Rebbe doesn't make a distinction between an ox and a bird. He says you're never allowed to lean against an animal. But only regarding a tree does he make this distinction and say that if it's a healthy tree, you're allowed to lean against it. So why is this distinction made? Where does it come from? Rav Chisda clearly held like the opinion of Rabbah. Remember before we learned that Rabbah says you're allowed to lean against the side of an animal. So Rav Chisda subscribes to the opinion of Rabbah, and he also agrees that you're allowed to lean against the side of an animal as well. And he just makes a distinction and says, although I say you're allowed to lean against the side of an animal, if the animal will be moved, so then you're not allowed to. So transferring this to the way we paskin, our halachic ruling is that the side of an animal is forbidden. Only the side of an animal is okay, which the analogy we gave before is leaning against the side of a wagon. So that would be okay as long as you're not moving the animal. Okay. But this, why are we making a distinction between the animal and the tree? If the source of the laws of the tree come from the laws of the animal, how come by an animal we say you can't lean against the animal, and again by a tree we say you can? So there are those that say that's the reason why the author put this halacha in a parentheses. This halacha comes from Siman Shimon Vav Sif Chaf Aleph, where the author puts this whole halacha of leaning against the tree in a parentheses. The author put many things in parentheses because he had a doubt about them, and he planned to look at them again and give a later halachic ruling, or leave them as a question. And perhaps some say this is what the author's question is. Maybe the reason the author put this in parentheses is because the author was questioning, why are we indeed more lenient by a tree than we are by an animal? Perhaps we should be more strict by a tree than we are by an animal. Therefore, we should not lean against the tree, even though the tree is healthy. So although the author's ruling is that you could, but because in parentheses, there is room to say that you should be strict, not lean against a tree at all, because that it's in a parentheses. But we're trying to get to a halacha l'mayis, a practical halachas over here, and we're not really having any wagons driving through the streets of Pico Robertson tonight. So let's talk about having pets for a second. People think that it's really permissible to have a pet on Shabbos, and although the Alter Rebbe says you can't lean against the animal, so you shouldn't lean against it. You're allowed to lift it up. Lift up an animal on Shabbos. But as we learned earlier, you're not allowed to lift it up. You're not allowed to even prod it along to play with it. You're only allowed to prod it along for it to find it for it to help the animal find its food. But just for you to play with the animal, to lift the animal up, is completely forbidden according to the Alter Rebbe. Just like it's forbidden to move the entire animal, it's also forbidden to move even part of the animal. So it's really not easy if you own a pet on Shabbos to take care to enjoy the animal, because you're not able to play with it at all, and all you could do on Shabbos, it seems, is just to give the animal its needs. So what about walking outside with the animal? Let's say there's an Erev, and you want to walk outside to walk your dog, and you have a leash, and the leash is there for the sake of the animal. And you're not allowed to walk outside in America without a leash, so you have to take a leash, so and there's an Erev. So would you be allowed to walk your dog on Shabbos? So it seems, you would think that it's okay, because the leash is there for the sake of the animal. You're holding on to the leash. You're not leaning against the animal. But there are several issues. One of them is easy to take care of, but the other two seem to be impossible. Issue number one, the Alter Rebbe says that when you hold on to a leash, you can't have the leash sticking out of your hand a tefach. It can't be a hand's breadth, the size of your hand, sticking out of the leash sticking out, because that doesn't seem to be part of for the sake of the animal. Since that's just sticking out of your hand, it seems that that's not connected to the usage of the animal, and therefore the Alter Rebbe says that it's forbidden to let that part of the leash stick out of your hand. Okay, so that you could take care of. You could hold on the leash from the very end. That's fine. But there's another issue. Other issue is that it says further, you're not allowed to have the leash touch the floor on Shabbos. You have to keep the leash above the ground. Now you're running with your dog. How are you going to keep your leash above the ground the whole time? Not only that, the Alter says you're not even let the leash get close to the ground within a tefach. So it's really impossible to walk your dog and be careful that the leash will not touch the floor unless you're really, really focusing on it. That's not really so easy, as he says in Sif Tes and Siman Shin Hey. If you're taking an animal outside, make sure that the top of the rope that you're pulling the animal with not sticking out of your hand more than a tafach. They should because it seems like you're carrying this part of the rope in your hand, it doesn't look like it's part of the animal. It doesn't look like it's part of the leash. And also be careful that the rope should be above the ground at tafach. Now, that would be difficult, but perhaps you might think that you'll take care of that. However, there's another issue. Other issue is you're taking your animal out to walk, and the animal is going, you have to take a bag with you also, right? Why are you allowed, halachically, to clean up after the animal on Shabbos? If the animal does something in your own house, so it's not considered a muktzah to clean up from the animal because it's called graf shel rei. The halacha says that if you're in a situation on Shabbos where you're very uncomfortable because things aren't so pleasant, things are dirty, so you want to enjoy the Shabbos, so you're allowed to move things which aren't pleasurable for you. Parenthetically, there's a very beautiful story about Moshe Feinstein. I don't know the exact details of the story. Someone asked Moshe, are you allowed to move something in your house on Shabbos that's a muktzah, which is not honorable on Shabbos? It's not honorable to have in your house. Let's say you want to move, let's say, for example, the television out of your living room because you felt the television doesn't belong in your living room on Shabbos. So you told Moshe, I think it should be allowed to remove your television out of the living room because it's not covered Shabbos. So Moshe responded, the honor of Shabbos is keeping the laws of Shabbos. So just because something is not to your fancy, to your level of religiosity on Shabbos, doesn't mean that you're allowed to move it on Shabbos. However, if something is bothering your nose and bothering your vision and bothering your comfortability on Shabbos, your body you can't handle that the dog has just made something in your living room. So that certainly is permissible. But why are you allowed to go in America? Your dog will make somewhere, you don't clean it up, you're going to get a fine. And besides the fact you're not going to get, so your neighbors aren't going to like you that much. So, and it's not the right thing to do anyway. So, but how are you allowed to go in the first place? Take the dog out in order to clean it. It doesn't seem to be in the category of graf shel rei. So, bottom line is that it would seem not so easy to take a dog out on Shabbos, keeping all these three considerations in mind: that it shouldn't stick out of your hand, that the rope shouldn't, that the leash shouldn't touch the ground, and in the first place that you're going to take the dog out to in a way that you're going to have to clean it in a way that runs into many questions on Shabbos. And that's what I wanted to share tonight. I hope it didn't ruin your evening, giving you all these additional stringencies that you may have heard before. But the bottom line is that keeping the Shabbos brings tranquility and peace, and being careful of Shabbos brings all the brachas of Hashem. As the Gemara says, in keeping the laws of Shabbos carefully, all of our averos, all sins are forgiven, and it brings the bracha of the true pikul from Mashiach Tzidkeinu. Any questions or comments or criticism, tomatoes or cucumbers? All right. Thank you, Yitzchak. Thank you for joining.